Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here in this fourth and final workshop of our workshop series on PPPs on hot topics. MCDF is a partnership program that supports connectivity infrastructure projects in developing countries by supporting them, making sure that those countries raise their standards on environmental and social safeguards, on debt management, on transparency, accountability, procurement, etc. And one of the work streams that MCDF has is on PPPs. In the past, we have focused on general training of PPPs, their relationship to debt management. But this year, we decided to have a series of conversations with practitioners to talk about topics that are really important and in front of their mind. We had the first one focused on how our country is tackling the really challenging issues of inflation, of high interest rates, or variable foreign exchange rates. We had one that were looking at how to set up project preparation funds for PPPs. Our third one focused on how to do PPPs for new technologies, particularly in the area of climate change, where the technologies are changing so rapidly, and these contracts last for 15, 20, 30 years. And we know that technology is going to change dramatically during that period. And we conclude this workshop series with the issue today that actually many national central governments are really not having enough resources to mobilize the public sector funding of PPP projects that is so indispensable to be able to leverage and mobilize the private funding that is needed to complete this project. I'm going to start with a brief overview presentation that gives you a little bit of the context, and then we're going to go to Lorena, Meco, and Jeff Delmon from the World Bank, who will be giving us an overview of a couple of those topics. Then we will have a panel conversation with a great, very diverse set of speakers that will be bringing practical experience from different corners of the world. So let me share the presentation, and then we can start. Again, the whole idea is to be able to give you a little bit of an overview of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. So the challenge, these are really difficult times. Debt levels are increasing in really drastic way. Actually, this is one of the most important challenges identified by the IMF as really going to affect not only developed countries, but also developing world. The global north and the global south are seeing levels of public debt that has not been seen ever. And what is therefore the consequence is that many of the developing countries are seeing very, very constrained levels of fiscal space, public resources to be able to invest in infrastructure. Then the solution in many cases is to say, why don't we invite the private sector and then jointly expand the base of resources that are available for these PPPs. But then if there is no public funding available, or at least to the levels that would be needed, then there is not a real partnership in that process, and the level of risk is seen by the private sector is much, much higher than what you see. So there are other potential sources that we have seen around the world that are being explored to enlarge that portion of the public funding. With the climate crisis that the world is facing, there has been mobilization of many new funds, global funds, that are really supporting action on climate. And PPPs are an important tool to be able to mobilize investment in renewable energy, in electric public transport, in hydropower, you name it. And therefore, accessing these global climate funds is an opportunity to enlarge the sources of public funding, and these come in different forms. I'll talk a minute or so about how do you access this kind of global climate funds. The carbon markets is a second opportunity that some have seen as an option. We are going to be talking about subnational financing. Sometimes when the national government doesn't have all of the resources, all of the public funding to support the PPPs, then everybody needs to pitch in, and therefore governments at the state or province level and governments at the city level can all contribute and bring fresh resources that together can be combined to a much larger envelope of public financing. We will be talking briefly about land value capture in one of the presentations. And of course, there's always the resource of guarantees where sometimes when the government is not able to bring fresh public funding, sometimes they are able to mobilize guarantees that give a little bit more confidence to the private sector to bring more financial resources and to lower the cost of capital. So on on climate financing, the largest source of funding currently is the Green Climate Fund that was set up a few years ago to be able to get resources from the global north to be able to support climate mitigation and adaptation actions in the global south. And in many cases, they have begun to get into PPPs, where the Green Climate Fund gives either grants or concessional funding or equity into some of these projects to be able to expand the public sector funding of this area. For example, the Desert to Power program that was initiated by the African Development Bank is designed to provide 10,000 megawatts of solar energy across the Sahel region. And part of the logic is to say, with the tremendous solar resources that are there in the Sahel region, and with the enormous needs for access to energy expanding in really radical ways through PPPs, so that solar power can be provided to 250 million people, including 90 million through off-grid solutions, is a way to go. So Green Climate Fund comes with a portion of grants on concessional loans that get combined with the loans of the African Development Bank to the countries, and then other financiers come to be able to set up a package that allows enough public funding for this kind of very large multi-billion-dollar program. So this is how accessing the Green Climate Fund, where every developing country has access to some of these resources. And if you're having a PPP that has important climate benefits, it is a way to go. It is, I think, one where the Green Climate Fund has been seen with positive perspectives, the possibility of using PPPs. Carbon markets have been seen always as an option where if there are projects where you can demonstrate and you can verifiably reduce emissions, then those carbon credits can be sold to industries in regions that are regulated and where there's a carbon market that allows them to do. Right now, lots of uncertainties in this process. The voluntary carbon credit has been hit by many questions on the validity of those carbon credits. So I don't want to give the impression that this is an easy process, an easy tool to use, but it is one that hopefully in the near future will stabilize with a better set of rules, more clear procedures to measure, report, and verify. Then this is going to be potentially another source of funding that is going to be interesting because it continues during the operation period of the transaction. So national financing, as I was saying, look, you have the opportunity to bring different stakeholders to the table. In the end, some of these large PPPs, PPP projects are benefiting subnational entities. Imagine cities and with public transport or drinking water, or imagine the states or provinces with highway programs. And therefore, bringing the financing from both central government and subnational governments at the state level or at the city level or any other combination allows not only a larger pool of funding, but also the opportunity to bring sources of funding with different levels of risk and different sources of revenue that provide more stability and more credibility to the PPP transaction. Land value capture is, in essence, a simple mechanism that is actually quite difficult to implement, but when it works really well. When you're doing infrastructure projects, it is expected and it is quite common that the value of the land in areas that are in close proximity to that infrastructure, to those infrastructure services, goes up. And then for some municipalities have been able to say, look, let's tax a portion of that land value increase and then use those revenues to finance the infrastructure. I'm showing here a picture of the subway, the metro system in Medellin, Colombia, that actually was financed by using that mechanism, where there is legislation that says, look, if you are receiving an increase in the value of the land, then you should be able to be taxed on that additional increase, and those revenues are directed precisely and focused only on those projects, so that the beneficiaries and the financiers actually are the same group of people. And they have really interesting formulas that allow them to calculate how much higher the land value increases in close proximity to the metro, particularly stations, and then how it spreads and goes down the further away you are from that infrastructure. So we're going to be hearing from Jeff and Lorena a little bit about these mechanisms that when you have a good, solid land registry and when you have the authorizing environment, then this can be a really important source of financing for this process. Finally, guarantees is a topic that we covered last year in our PPP capacity building series, where international organizations that provide guarantees, like, for example, MIGA, the government gets a guarantee and says, look, we will protect the private investor against these risks, and we commit, and here is a guarantee that allows you to lower the risk. So that way the government is not putting all of the financial resources for the public side, but it is putting a contingent liability, a promise that if things go wrong on certain areas, then this is that they will come up, that MIGA will cover the public sector provider, the private sector partner to be able to be covered on this one. So these are some of the examples of MIGA that actually has been able to expand services through the guarantees, and they only focus on PPPs to be able to support that process. So in conclusion, there is a large set of potential opportunities, not all apply to every PPP, but what we want to give you today through the conversation is an opportunity to get a feel for how different countries have used these tools. We're going to move to the second segment of this workshop series, where we're going to be having a presentation by Lorena Meco and Jeff Delmon. Lorena is a program officer with the Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility, PIAF, who are co-sponsors of this workshop series. And she focuses in her work at the World Bank on asset recycling, alternative financing sources, and climate change financing in infrastructure, topics that are very relevant to the conversation today. She regionally works in Latin America, Europe, and Central Asia, and the Middle East. And Jeff Delmon is a senior PPP specialist who has been with the World Bank since 2005, almost 2 decades of work on legal and regulatory enabling environments for PPP, municipal PPP programs, infrastructure funds. Before the World Bank, he spent 11 years in Paris and London with law firms, also providing advisory services for PPP. He's the author of 14 books on these topics, and the most recently is quite relevant: Innovative Funding and Financing for Infrastructure, Addressing Scarcity of Public Resources. So we couldn't be happier to be able to hear from Jeff's work in this area. And with that, let me invite this presentation that is going to be done both first by Lorena and then Jeff on the topic. With a big thank you for joining us today. Lorena?
Thanks so much, Eddie. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Eddie did such a great job of outlining basically most of the concepts we'll be touching on. It's a great pleasure to be part of this Hot Topics workshop on PPPs. And today I'll be presenting one perspective on how governments can unlock innovative financing for sustainable infrastructure through PPPs. My focus specifically will be on addressing the immense challenges that cities face in financing infrastructure and providing practical solutions for attracting private investment. I'll also discuss the City Creditworthiness Initiative, which is led by the World Bank and that PF has supported since its early days. This program plays a vital role in enabling cities to access new sources of finance. So next slide, please. Thank you. To begin, let's examine the scale of the infrastructure challenge. By 2030, cities will require an estimated 93 trillion in infrastructure investment to meet the demands of urbanization and climate resilient goals. However, there's still a significant gap, even though cities are currently investing 2.5 to 3 trillion annually. What is needed is closer to 4.5 to 5 trillion dollars worth of investment. This gap exists in critical sectors like transportation, water and sanitation, and climate resilience, which Eddie so well outlined in his presentation. This challenge is then compounded by cities' limited access to capital markets, the weak creditworthiness of many of these cities, and along with that is their reliance on unpredictable government transfers. And lastly, many cities lack sufficient own source revenue generation. So things like property tax collection, and this limits their ability to invest in infrastructure in the long term. So what are ways cities can close this financing gap? One critical solution lies in leveraging innovating financial instruments, things like municipal bonds, land value capture instruments, and PPPs. Municipal bonds, for example, allow cities to tap into future revenues by issuing debt tied to specific infrastructure projects. Then we have land value capture, which Jeff will go into much better detail on. And this capitalizes on the increases in land value capture created by the infrastructure investments, like public transit systems, for example. And last, PPPs. This offers a structure to engage private investors in delivery and financing of infrastructure projects, thus reducing the financial burden on the public sector, which, as Eddie mentioned, the debt levels worldwide are really out of control and a real worry. So we have these financing mechanisms and they are promising. Cities often face challenges such as regulatory barriers. So this can be in the form of weak, inadequate, or even inexistential regulatory frameworks that prevent cities from accessing capital markets or effectively using innovative financial instruments. Then, of course, there are capacity constraints, which is true for many of you that work with PPPs. Capacity is one of the main aspects that is lacking in the PPP ecosystem, and many cities lack the technical capacity to design, to implement, or to manage complex infrastructure projects or financing structures. And the last pillar of risk management. Infrastructure projects, by their nature, especially in emerging markets, they come with high risks, and they include financial risks or even project implementation risk, as well as lately more and more we see a lot of climate-related risk. This is where the City Creditworthiness Initiative comes in, and what it helps to do, it helps to address some of these issues by providing cities with the tools to improve their financial management, to enhance their transparency, and to increase their creditworthiness. The idea is that in doing so, cities can help better navigate regulatory barriers, build the capacity to manage complex projects, and improve their access to finance. The City Creditworthiness Initiative, it offers the tested operational templates. It is now on version 3.0, and it helps cities identify critical demand and regulatory issues to improve their financial management systems and recommend policy changes to strengthen municipal debt frameworks. The main goal of this is to improve city and subnational government regulatory frameworks with the idea to access debt finance more effectively and to strengthen their overall financial position. For example, cities that go through City Creditworthiness Initiative often enhance their ability to engage in PPPs. Through the initiative, we do look at capital investment planning, especially climate smart capital investment planning, and try to build a bankable pipeline to attract private investment. Next, we will look at some of the topics covered in the City Creditworthiness Initiative, and there are four main pillars of first, financial and fiscal management, which includes things like revenue mobilization, expenditure control, and debt management, which all in theory help cities optimize their financial resources so that they can fund these infrastructure projects. The second pillar is the creditworthiness and financial planning. So cities learn how to improve their credit ratings, produce accurate financial statements, and develop long-term capital investment plans. With the credit ratings, for example, we've seen that if a city either improves their position or they issue credit ratings, that are on par with sovereign, for example, they are better able to access markets in order to fund the infrastructure projects. PPPs, which we'll be talking about in this session, of course, and investment promotion. So the initiative has guidance on how to structure PPPs, the typical PPP capacity building, in order to attract private investment and to help develop those robust, bankable pipeline of projects that garner that private sector interest. And last, the risk management and climate resilience. This is becoming, of course, more important by the day. And the idea under City Creditworthiness Initiative is that cities are trained on how to identify and mitigate financial risks and how to integrate climate finance and resilience planning into their infrastructure projects. We can then take a look at just a couple of the success stories using these financing mechanisms that Eddie actually mentioned in his presentation. And it doesn't just have to be one instrument necessarily. As you'll see here, there are mixes of instruments that help leverage projects or bring them to market in order to reach that success. The first one is the Maldives Waste to Energy project. The Maldives, especially in their capital city, face significant challenges related to waste management in its capital. And using green bonds and climate finance, the country was able to secure capital for a waste to energy project. This project still serves as a model for other island nations, demonstrating how environmental protection can be paired with energy generation to attract both local and international investors. And another waste management project is in Mexico City being one of the most populated cities and complicated cities in the world, used thematic bonds, and in this case it was social bonds, along with partial risk guarantees, which Eddie mentioned, to modernize its waste management infrastructure. The project improved waste collection and recycling, but also created jobs because in waste collection, many of the quote unquote jobs are informal in the informal sector, and in the most impacted are the lower socioeconomic levels, and particularly women, which is why social bonds was a good fit in this case. And these are just some examples, but we have a whole program of subnational financing, and Jeff in his presentation will probably go into more detail about other instruments that we use to finance infrastructure around cities. In conclusion, I'd just like to thank you for listening, and to say that the City Creditworthiness Initiative and the utilization of some of these innovative financing mechanisms is essential for sustainable infrastructure development, since most of the world's population is living and will continue to be living in city environments. But addressing the regulatory challenges, building institutional capacity, and tapping into these other non-traditional sources of finance like green bonds or blended finance, will unlock the full potential of PPPs and help cities meet their growing demand, their growing infrastructure demands. Thank you very much, and I pass it on to Jeff.
Thank you, Lorena, and welcome, Jeff. Great to have you here. Go ahead.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ed. And thanks, Lorena, for getting things moving. Very exciting. Fantastic topic. And maybe you could go to the next slide. I am fascinated by the way we approach infrastructure. We have a tendency as infrastructure professionals, and I've lumped myself into this category, to look at infrastructure as a problem. How do we finance this infrastructure? Where do we get the money to pay for this infrastructure? And we think about users and how users are going to use the infrastructure, and so they should pay, which is absolutely right. You know, you should pay for the benefit you get, and that way we create a benefit that people want, that they will pay for. So it's a nice little virtuous circle. We're going to get the users to pay. But what we tend to do is say, all right, users pay. If they can't pay enough, where does the rest of the money come from? And let's get government to pay for the rest. And so the balance is either users or government. And we miss all of this tremendous potential of infrastructure. When you build something, it creates value for the people that receive the service. It usually changes the value of land. And Ede mentioned land value capture. The land around infrastructure, often, depending on what you're building, if you're building a landfill, probably less so, but if you're building an urban transit project, if you're stringing up a neighborhood with electricity, or you're providing water, you're providing sewage services, that property gets more value. So why don't those property owners share in the cost of delivering the asset? And so, of course, we think property tax, great. We'll tax these people and get the money from them. But tax is a zero-sum game. Tax is saying, you're going to make money, I'm going to take part of it. But this is PPP, right? And what's the third P? Partnership. So how can we bring public and private together, not just to share that benefit that's created, but to together make more benefit? So in land value capture, for instance, the simple approach to land value capture is property tax. Let's take a proportion of the increased value of the land and let's pull it back and use it to pay for part of the infrastructure. Shouldn't we instead look at development rights? So let's rezone the land around the infrastructure. Let's allow greater concentration of development of property so that that land not only increases in value, but increases multiples in value. And you see some countries, Japan does a fantastic job at this. As they build out their rail system, their metro system, they work carefully with the private sector to increase the value of the investment the private sector is going to make. And then the share that comes back to government is many times more than what it would be if we took a very linear approach to just taxing. In the same way, not just land becomes more valuable, but opportunities are rich around these projects. And those commercial opportunities create economic growth. They create jobs. They create new business opportunities. They create jobs for youth and innovation and entrepreneurs and all of this stuff that can be captured in this space. Now we could say, good, fine. Private sector is going to come in and make a bunch of money off of this. We could just tax them, corporate tax, income tax. But again, that's a zero-sum game. Let's use this infrastructure to make even more value. So if you go to the next slide, let's think about infrastructure in a more dynamic manner. What are all the things we can do around an infrastructure project? And then in a good PPP approach, the partnership approach, let's design the asset. Let's do all the consultations. Let's talk to the local community. Let's talk to the local business community. Let's talk to the private sector and be proactive in creating commercial value around assets. And then not only are we getting the private investment in those commercial value to help us fund the infrastructure, but we're multiplying the value of that land. And I'm not sure if we're supposed to respond to the questions that have been raised, but Errol Rizag asked a couple of really pointed questions, and which I think are really valuable. When we think about a train station, we build a train station. But what about the space underneath the train station? What about the space on top of the train station? There's some great projects that were done in South America where the government wanted to rebuild a park. the park was old and dilapidated. So what do? Where do we get money from a park? No one's going to pay to go into a park. Instead, they dug out the park. They put a couple of levels of parking underneath the park. They put some commercial retail space under the park, and then they put a beautiful park on top. Now people have someplace to park when they go to the park, but they also have all this revenue coming from the parking underneath and the retail space underneath. You're creating opportunities, you're creating revenue. And they did that not just out of government sitting in a room deciding this is a great idea, but in consulting with the private sector and using that partnership model. Advertising is huge. There's a project in Kenya, Nairobi, where street lighting was replaced. And the cost of the street lighting came from advertising, putting a little advertisement on each one of the street lighting poles. And the revenue from that was enough to pay for the street lighting. And the electricity still came from government, but all the street lights were replaced and maintained and operated using the money from this advertising space. I was in a castle over the summer, this fantastic castle in England, beautiful old around, it was more than 1,500 years ago this castle was built. And there were all these insignias on the wall. And those insignias represented the rich people that paid for part of the castle. And it's a bit like our stadiums now have different companies' names. Those naming rights are really powerful. And they've always been a fundamental part of the way we get private sector to invest in these big public assets. So let's think in a really dynamic way. Next slide, please. And that includes carbon credits. And there was a question raised about whether carbon credits were bogus and they were completely discredited. Let me give you a quick thought on that. Carbon credits are a great way to get big companies to help us pay for good things. Those big companies help us invest in low carbon solutions. They get credit for being good people, and we get the money to spend on low carbon. So while I agree with you that the current situation is messy, we're going through all kinds of different iterations and trying to fix this. Fundamentally, this is a really great opportunity to bring new revenues into infrastructure by creating value in our infrastructure projects, and then an incentive for infrastructure to be more and more low carbon to attract more of these carbon credits from the market. So all of these virtuous circles we can create within the context of the market. And one great example of this is transit-oriented development, which is around urban transit, or any transit, frankly, even national rail, whatever it might be. Those transit projects change the face of a local community. The urban context changes completely when you bring in public transport. And so you can bring in retail and housing and commercial. I live in Singapore, so I'm beaming you across from Singapore. In Singapore, all of the metro stations, or most of them, on top of them are either a shopping mall or an office building. And they make huge amounts, government makes massive amounts of money by selling the airspace, by developing the airspace both above and below the transit station, and working with the private sector and creating all of this value. So how do we bring this into the models that we're working in Thailand at the moment, doing exactly this, rethinking the way we look at transport projects, forcing the engineers to sit with the urban development people and the urban planners, and the two don't necessarily get along, but helping them work together and realizing that together, the value of what they create is so much more than what they could create otherwise. Next slide, please. Part of the problem is getting central and local government to work together. And for a lot of these, especially municipal projects, municipality wants to drive the project, but the money's at central government. Local government does not want central government looking over their shoulder or controlling things. Central government wants to make sure that the money is spent well and that the investment that is generated does good things, understandably, and wants to protect the local government from getting itself too much in debt. How do we balance those two? How do we help those two work together? How do we work with the transport and the urban development? Do you do the transport first, in which case there aren't going to be as many users, and then the urban development? Or do you do the urban development first and create a pull factor for the transport? And the reality is that in both cases, you need to work carefully to figure out which way you'll make the most money, provide the best services, bring the most attention and energy into the project to make that project develop. And finally, and this leads into one of the other questions about selling airspace above and below land that's acquired for infrastructure. This is a tricky question. Governments are uncomfortable competing with the private sector. They don't want to squeeze out the private sector, nor do they want to be seen to be doing commercial stuff that it should be done by the private sector. Totally understandable. And yet, if we don't create these partnerships, and PPP is a great way to solve this, make sure that the government delivers its infrastructure, but allow the private sector and enable the private, work with the private sector to deliver the development through the air rights, the development of the subsurface rights. A lot of countries don't have concepts of air rights and subsurface, but the principle being, if you're going to acquire some land and you're going to force people out to build a rail system, then for heaven's sake, use that as efficiently as possible. It would be inconsistent with the role of government to not use that property efficiently. And so creating opportunities for commercial development, jobs, economic growth above and below that land just makes sense. Now, how do we deliver that under the legal and regulatory framework? And that can be tricky. But we've done that in a number of countries, and there are ways of doing that. There are models that we've used in order to deliver those programs. And final slide, please. And again, a little pitch, sorry, this is a very self-congratulatory, but this is the book that Ede was mentioning. It's the most recent one, just out this year. It's about innovative funding and financing, so ways of getting new revenues in, and a section on carbon credits, a section on commercial value capture, land value capture, and also financing, Islamic finance, climate finance, blended finance, how these different finance modes affect the way that you develop your project and deliver them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, and I strongly recommend the book. I browsed through it a couple of days ago, and it has a wealth of information very much related to this workshop. Just to confirm that the presentations, the videos, and these additional resources will be shared with all of you after the workshop, so that you get additional information and you can share it with your colleagues. So I have a set of questions for Jeff and Lorena. I have 6 questions, so I'm going to ask them in groups of 3. And then it's up to you to decide how do you actually divide them in that process. Now, you presented several exciting examples of success, but I'm sure that you have come across failures, things that didn't work. We love to hear lessons from those failures, issues that you would recommend practitioners to say, pay special attention to these things because this may lead to complete collapse of the transaction. So that's one. Second, this is especially for Lorena. What has been your experience on the most important first steps that cities take after going through the Creditworthiness Academy? What do you think are, if you're sitting with a city that is really interested in embarking in this journey, what would you say, okay, one or make sure that these are the basics, 1 and 2 or 3 that comes in that process. The other one, it was for both of you, is that a key success for many of the cases that you have described is to have a clear revenue stream that the private sector can trust. How do you earn that trust? How do you make sure that you have enough information? What tools or tips can you give confidence to the private sector, particularly when you are imagining some of these new streams that are just not the tariffs, the fees for the service? Any advice on those processes? Okay, so lessons from failures, practical steps as cities strengthen their creditworthiness, and then how to earn trust on the revenue stream. And then I'll ask you the next 3.
Okay, fantastic. First of all, on the city creditworthiness, I've had I've been able to lecture on a couple of these programs. They're fantastic. In two of the countries that I lectured in, the city creditworthiness asked all the questions that created this momentum of a program of reforms, great ideas, enthusiasm, excitement. Those are really, really important ways of launching into reform programs, which is super exciting. On failures, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, so on failures, obviously we've seen loads of failures because this is really tricky. It's a tricky space. And quite frankly, I've never seen a 100% successful project. I don't think I've seen a 100% successful infrastructure project. every one of them, and which is what makes it interesting, right? And which keeps us all in jobs, is that every infrastructure project is really hard, and you get new challenges every day, every week that you're going to have to adjust to. So just a couple of quick things on that. One is expectations. So the number of times that I've done some of these presentations, cities get super excited and they go running and they get all these great ideas. So I was working with one little town in Africa, 100,000 people. They had this space that they wanted to build out, and they came back with a picture of one of these big American football stadiums that cost several $billions to build. And they said, this is what we're going to do in our city. So we're so excited, this is what we're going to do. And it was fantastic. But we've got to keep the expectations reasonable, because you don't want to overstretch and create unrealistic expectations. And I think the second thing is the relationship between central and local government. It's really important to launch into that early, have those conversations, get people comfortable with each other, make sure you can work together, because the tension between the two doesn't need to be tension. It needs to be collaboration. It needs to be partnership. But to do that, there are a lot of conversations, a lot of discussions. Feed into your program enough time to have those conversations. And I'll do a quickie on the trust on revenue stream. I wish I had a magic wand on that one. A lot of it's about history. It's about the past. And unfortunately, a lot of us have bad experiences with that trust. And so it's hard for the private sector to rely on our programs. Having, of course, having the right partners. So bring the World Bank in with you to be your trusted partner and work with you. But seriously, it's who you surround yourself with. So they'll know you're serious when you've got good advisors, when you've asked a lot of the questions in advance, when you've really done your homework. If you're running out to the market and throwing stuff at people, you don't create trust, you create nervousness. If you do your homework, if you have the right people around you, if you sit with them and you're honest and you share information, you make things open, that can help in building that trust. Not a magic wand, but can be very helpful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Lorena?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. So I'll start with the city creditworthiness point about the program, right? So it is not, the academies are not something that you have the academy and then you go away. It has to be part of an ecosystem. So for example, an operation or some sort of concerted effort in the long run for what Jeff was talking about, which is this roadmap of reform. And another thing is that we don't do a creditworthiness academy for one city, right? So it is a bunch of cities. So it does create a community of practice. And this also, there is a signal, in order for us to go in, there has to be a signal from the national level that they want to empower these cities, right? And there are different kinds of profiles of cities. So obviously not all cities, for example, should be doing credit ratings. Some medium-sized cities should probably be working on on-source revenue, should probably be working from the national government to make sure that the transfers are predictable, because oftentimes there are politics involved and whatnot. But it is very much about the country being ready at the national level and then having enough cities to have a critical mass to join these academies and learn from each other. And, you know, there's no competition. So it's great for that kind of capacity building, critical mass that you need in the country, right? And the academies themselves, the interesting thing is they start with a self-assessment, right? So there's a self-assessment tool, which we're now updating in its third iteration to include a lot of questions like the thematic areas like climate resilience, which shouldn't be a thematic area, it should be kind of a universal pillar and not just a talking point, because obviously there are real consequences if those things aren't considered. So it does start with a self-assessment. So cities very much have to be active participants. So it is a real capacity building in the long run exercise, right? And it's not a one-time thing. And it does consider, besides, so I talked so much about the revenue part and the, you know, financial health and financial position of cities, because if you don't consider that while you're looking at a PPP pipeline or a capital investment plan, then usually, since you are the 1P, the first P in PPPs, you're not going to be a solid partner, and therefore investors will be less likely to engage with you necessarily, right? On the failures, or more than failures, lessons learned, we have a comprehensive program in Colombia on city creditworthiness, but also on land value capture, specifically with tax increment financing. And what we found when we first went in to work with the city of Medellin, for example, is that we started by defining this pilot project, right, in an innovation district, so sort of like a Silicon Valley for Medellin. And what we saw there was that there was a missing regulatory framework for the city to be able to issue bonds, right? So we had to work with the National Department of Planning, then a very strong champion. And that's something you need. Jeff mentioned it. You need collaboration. And more than that, you need championing at the national level in order to be able to adjust the framework so that cities could borrow in longer than 4-year terms, right? Because many of these bonds and infrastructure projects are just long-term. So I wouldn't call it a failure, but it's actually a lesson learned that helps us adjust on the go. And in that same project, for example, we defined a very spiffy, very nice, neat project. But then we realized the real estate dynamics, right, which are very important when it comes to tax increment financing, were not necessarily there, right? And the private sector interest to invest in that project was not there for the whole project, which was about 400 blocks. So what we did, we adjusted to tranche the project out. The first pilot, I think 40 blocks, and then expanded to the next 100 to see how these tranches went as they went out to the market. There was a question that I want to address on, which goes to the revenue stream question for waste projects specifically. We're not saying that these projects necessarily will be bankable on their own, right? That's why we're talking about all of these mechanisms to help make it as attractive as possible. I think we are working at PIAF, we are working a lot more with waste projects in general, not necessarily just waste energy, which is of course way more capital intensive. But it's important to be sincere when we're talking about the revenues, right? Let's plan for that, less optimistic scenario, because when you go out to the market, the private investors will know if something is not realistic. And therefore, if we are more conservative in what we're saying our revenues are, it is easier to build the foundational blocks of bringing in things like social bonds, which of course are more favorable terms, green bonds, to use blended finance and the partial risk guarantees. So I think it's important it be an honest exercise in order to have the best chance when it goes to market. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorena. Jeff, let me go with the second round of questions. We have a good 5-6 minutes to cover them. The first one is on green bonds. There's always a lot of excitement on green bonds. I would always tell cities, look, before you're able to issue a green bond, you need to be able to issue a dirty bond. There are basics in that process. But what advice would you give to cities that can do, let's say, the basic bonds? What advice can you give in terms of moving from the basic to the green bonds? What is it that they need to get ready in that process? Second, in many of these instruments, land use planning is a key, and Jeff highlighted how important that breaking the silos between the engineering, construction departments and the urban land processes. And for example, I always remember one colleague from Japan who said that the entire intermunicipal rail system was built through these development rights, and actually the train operators are not real train operators. They're real estate companies that subcontract the rail operation to other specialized companies. So this breaking the silos is important. But what has been your experience? Is it better to do the TOD and the urban planning and then the PPP, or the other one? You went a little bit too quickly, Jeff, on that, and there's an interest to expand a little bit. I remember the Metro of Quito, where actually they began building all of the government, new government buildings on top of the stations, while the construction of the metro was actually starting to be able to match it together and create the demand. But give us a few thoughts on that. And then finally, there's an interesting question where we have talked about provincial governments and city governments, but have you seen examples of grouping multiple cities for a special vehicle project where you are doing PPPs, what has been the experience and the additional complexities or benefits of doing that process? So why don't we go with those 3 questions, and then I'll give you a huge sign of appreciation after that, then we move to the panel. So now we'll inverse, Lorena, then Jeff.
Thank you. So I leave the question you addressed to Jeff for Jeff. I'll talk about the green bonds question, right? And it goes a little bit to what I was saying that City Creditworthiness Initiative looks at. And the thing is, we can't just look at a project and see how we can green it. The greening really comes in the philosophy, let's say, of the city, the planning. This is why we look at climate smart capital investment planning and not look at a capital investment plan and see where the green potential is, or when we're looking at financing options. So there needs to be a real commitment there, because that commitment is also monetized, right? In the risk that, in the design phases or in the assessment of the feasibility stage, for example, of a project is not necessarily as green as it can be. So I think the foundational blocks are important. The commitment to that is important to make sure we're not just greenwashing or kind of stuffing a green bond wherever we see that we can have it. And then your last question was on, pardon me.
Last question on grouping multiple cities.
On grouping. So we have some interesting things happening, for example, in adaptation finance. And PF has a new program on adaptation finance and biodiversity. One of the projects is the West Africa coastal area, right? Which of course has a lot of erosion. So it is a grouping of a very expansive area. There have to be the right technical analysis behind it so that it can be grouped, and you can look at the types of revenue streams that adaptation finance would fit, but that's definitely doable. We also see it in places, for example, like Peru, where we have particularly regional water operations, for example, and we have a colleague here from the private operators, I think, water association, so they might be more familiar with these, but definitely grouping is done more and more, not necessarily for the bigger cities, but for medium-sized cities or for areas where the, let's say, geography makes sense, is doable. And for nature-based solutions is definitely something that you do look at, because you look at an ecosystem and not where the bureaucratic boundary ends. And I'll hand it over to Jeff with that.
Jeff.
All right, you answered all the hard questions. That's perfect. So green bonds, don't forget that there are, and that green bonds are not the only kind of green finance. And Eddie mentioned this earlier. There are a lot of sources, and most of the sources of climate finance are public. Each one has its own set of rules that can be a little bit painful to go through the process, but some of that financing can be very interesting, can be cheaper. Commercial finance, green bonds, and otherwise, whether sustainability linked or the sort of typical against activities that are going to be green in nature, there are already quite a few structures in place so that you know what you need to satisfy. There are groups that will help you verify that you've done what you're supposed to do. So don't go by yourself. There are a lot of good groups to help you think through these different parts of the process. And there's some trails that have been laid. They're not all of them easy, but have a look at what other people have done. And there's a lot of really interesting experience out there. On land use planning and the links between, so this is a tricky question. I would say, if you can, build the urban transit first, build out your rail project first, and then develop the land. And that's just maximizing value of land. If I've got the rail there, the land becomes much more valuable and much more exciting. However, there's a carry cost involved in that. So if I invest in the rail, my traffic is going to be very low. The users are going to be low until I've developed the property. And I need to develop the rail in a capacity that will respond to the land that's developed eventually. So if in 3 or 4 years, I've got a whole bunch of people living in this space, I need to build the rail to that capacity, which means I've now spent all this money on something that's not going to make a lot of revenue in the interim. So if you can carry the cost, that's great. Reality is most of us can't. And so you need to have an interim, so you need to have a compromise. Do a little bit of development where you can squeeze the amount, and you can do a lot of market consultations to make sure that you leave as little money on the table as possible, that you create the kind of value in your investments in the land that's going to attract more investment. but also that you don't necessarily go into the things that are super high value once the rail is in place, and maybe leave those until later or do them in a phased manner. The grouping of cities, super interesting stuff. We've had a couple of countries that use special economic zones, or in Thailand, they have something called the Eastern Economic Corridor, and which is basically creating by law a zone that has special rules that makes it easier to attract investment, that makes it more attractive for foreign investment. And then in that way, you can group cities together and get them to work together. You can pool cities for the purposes of debt. So you have a pool of debt that's then on lent to cities, because sometimes cities by themselves don't have the credit worthiness, they don't have the experience, they don't have the facilities to manage a debt program. But if you put the cities together, the lenders can go into a pool, and that then diversifies the risk, makes it easier for the cities to work together. Of course, the challenge is that if those cities drop away, or if you've got political changes, you've got elections, all of that stuff. But if you've got a good pool of cities, you can also use them for carbon credits. One city going out for carbon credits on energy efficiency or rooftop solar, whatever it might be, you may not have the volume that you need. But if you get a group of cities together they can bring their emission reductions together and then generate credits. And then buyers of emission reduction will be much more interested in a pool of credits from a bunch of cities rather than individual credits from individual cities or individual activities. And just a thought, you may want to think about an anchor city. And I've seen this, Beijing has done this in other big cities where they want to help the little cities around them, because there is a relationship, a really important relationship between the big cities and the cities around them, and that you use the big city as the anchor weight in this sort of pooling concept, and then bring the other cities around it. And that anchor city can take a lot of the sort of create the gravity that brings the financiers, that brings the investors, that brings the attention, and then helps the other cities around them come to the table and develop that capacity. Thank you.
Yeah, Lorena, thank you very much for these excellent presentations and the conversation. I think that it enriches what we wanted to achieve with these workshops, where conversations are more practitioners, and you have really brought so much practical experience that this is what we're looking for. A huge thanks for joining us today.